partnership with DJPC, so we can really kind of bridge those divides between our students, professors, and the community, and also bring what we teach our students in the classroom and conduct research on to actual work on solidarity and work with people on the ground. So I know that many of you in DJPC, for many of you, Todd Miller needs no introduction for anyone who follows issues on the border, especially border militarization and its deleterious impacts. But for those of you who don't know, he's an award-winning author and independent journalist based in Tucson, Arizona, who's been writing about border issues for over 15 years. He's also spent a lot of time in Oaxaca, Mexico. His works appear in the New York Times, The Nation, San Francisco Chronicle, In These Times, Al Jazeera. He actually just had a piece come out related to his new book, Empire of Borders, in The Nation just yesterday. He's the author of 3 books, brand new ones. Sorry, I meant to bring that up. And both of his recent books are up here for sale. You can talk to Todd after if you would like one. Empire of Borders, which just came out about a week or 2 ago, the expansion of the U.S. border around the world, which he spoke about today at the University of Denver. He's also the author of, and what we asked him to come speak tonight about, Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security, which was also recently published in 2017. And we brought him here to DJPC as we know the interest and passion that this group has for the overlap of understanding issues of imperialism and environment. That book, he was the recipient in 2018 of the Izzy Award for Excellence in Investigative Journalism. He's also the boarder, many of you who've been following these issues for longer might know Border Patrol Nation, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Homeland Security, published by City Lights in 2014. He's also a contributing editor on border and immigration issues for NACLA, Report on the Americas, and especially for its column, Border Wars. His work has been critical for understanding and connecting the dots, and in fact, very inspirational in many cases to my own work as well, between border militarization, U.S. imperialism, climate change, as well as, if you read Empire of Borders, the security industry, and as well as in Storming the Wall. So it's my pleasure to introduce Todd Miller.
Thank you. Do you prefer that I sit down on this, or does it matter to people? No. I'll sit. But if my voice isn't projecting, I'll stand. Whoa, this is pretty. First of all, many thanks to Rebecca and Rebecca, for your introductions, and it's really an honor to be here with the DJPC. I got the acronym correct. So I'm not from Denver, so please forgive me. I've come from Tucson, Arizona. Came in yesterday, so I've been here. I'm going to be in Colorado Springs tomorrow, and then I head back to Tucson tomorrow night. Yeah, it's great to see a bunch of familiar faces. My compañeros from the Migrant Trail Walk, for example. The Migrant Trail Walk is a 75-mile walk that is done every at the end of May, starting on Memorial Day every year. It's been done every year for 16 years now? 17 years. That people are doing a 75-mile, 7-day walk, and that's going to keep on happening until people stop dying as they cross the border. And it's great to see other faces that I recognize from other events as well. So it's really fantastic to be here. I was in Missoula, Montana, in April of this year. And when I was in Missoula, I said this is probably the last time I'm going to do a talk on Storming the Wall, because I have a new book coming out. And I can't, and so I hope you feel honored. No. But I figured that might, that was going to be the last time, and lo and behold, it is not. I'm actually going to be doing some presentations around the country with Empire of Borders, the new book that just came out this this spring, this fall. But I've been amazed like how many requests I've had to also speak about storming the wall, and so I had to resurrect my index cards on them. So hopefully, I was just looking over. I'm like, well, hopefully I can do it justice. Even though I haven't, done this my mind has been on other things. Though this book is very relevant. I mean, it takes in many ways, the new book takes the analysis in Storming the Wall and Border Patrol Nation, like the two. It's like Border Patrol Nation and from an international point of view, and then it definitely advances the climate analysis that's in Storming the Wall. But I'll just start with Storming the Wall. And one place I like to start is a story from when I was doing research with Storming the Wall, and that was I went to the Philippines. That was one of the places where I went, and I went to the island of Marinduque. And I went to the island of Marinduque because that's where my grandmother is from. It was the first time I'd ever been to that island. I'd heard about it all my life. I'd heard stories and stories from my grandparents and my aunts and uncles' childhoods from that island. But I went there as it was partly a personal journey, and partly, I was doing research for Storming the Wall just to see like what was going on in terms of climate change. So at one point I talked to an official who was looking at what is the reality for Marinduque in 2050, and he talked about a number of issues, including sea level rise. It's an island, right? Philippines is 7,000 islands, and he pointed out some parts of the island where I could go and see it for myself. So I was walking along the beach near this town called Balogo, and I came across. Well, I was with some other people, but we came across a house, and the house was actually so that on that particular day there was a typhoon, but a typhoon way in the north in the island of Luzon. But the typhoon was big enough. It wasn't a huge typhoon like the others that people have heard about probably with the Philippines, but it was enough that it was making the sky gray. There was a bit of a storm surge, so the waves are coming in and the sky was gray, and the waves are literally lapping into the house, coming in and out of the house. And I remember just standing there and just looking at it, because the house had been abandoned. It was like looking at a carcass or a cadaver. It was like looking at something that was dead, right? It had died. So then I was looking at that, and then a little bit further, about 10 minutes after I came across the house, I interviewed a fisherman who started. I asked him, so how much has the sea level risen, in here, and in the last little while? And he pointed out to this buoy, and this buoy was like kind of rocking on the waves in the kind of far out, like really far out, more far out than I thought. It was actually literally rocking on the waves. He said the shore used to be there, and I went, wow. And then shortly thereafter, a father carrying a child walked out onto the beach, and I still remember because the wind's blowing, and the hair of the child was kind of long. He must have been like he or she must have been 1 or 2 years old, or I didn't know the age, but it was pretty young. And I just remember like looking at the child and just being mesmerized, like thinking about what is the future for that child, right? With the sea level rise, they had already the community of Baloga that had already kind of backed up, where their homes. But would they still have to back up further? Would the water come in to make it unlivable, uninhabitable? Would they have to go to Boac, which is the kind of capital of the province of Marinduque? Would they have to go to Manila, capital of the Philippines, of course, or they go elsewhere across borders? What was the future for that child in 30 years? And so what I did was I stepped aside, and I started writing in my journal at that point. I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And little did I know that was going to be the opening scene of Storming the Wall, like the first very scene that I wrote about. And the child is really important. That's why I'm very much enjoying having the children here, because the book when I was writing the book, my first child was on the way, right? So in a lot of ways, it was dedicated to like the unborn generations, right? The generations to come, and I dedicated the book to my child, who turned out to be William, who was born when I was right when I was in the writing process of it, and really it was dedicated to William because it was to his generation, right? The generation of that to come that are going to be most impacted, as we've seen so clearly in the last week or so, especially with the climate strike and probably things that people here have been involved with, and that speech by at the United Nations Summit, where the "How dare you" speech from the 16-year-old girl from Sweden, Greta Thunberg, but who represents so many youth that are now like stepping up. So, and I was really moved by all of what I've been seeing for the last little bit, and I guess I'm proud to say that this is dedicated to the children. That might sound too cliche, but anyhow, so the Storming the Wall was a lot of traveling. I traveled a lot of places. The Philippines was one place. I went to like Paris for the 2015 Climate Summit. Central America, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's the U.S.-Mexico border region, where I live, and both sides of the border. And just to look at, the main thing I was looking at is the connections between climate change, the displacement of people, and borders. And in each place, my goal was to talk to as many people as I possibly could, from officials to those most impacted. Wide range of people, and to like gather stories from each place. The most compelling stories I could find from each place that told this story of these connections. And the way I've done this presentation is by trying to tell those stories. Like I started out doing the presentations with a PowerPoint, and then I soon, when I first went on a book presentation tour for this, but I soon realized that I really wanted to just tell some of the stories that came from doing these research, kind of like the first one I just told. So that spirit, that's how I'd like to do this presentation, and I think I'll talk for maybe about 30 minutes more, and then we can go into some discussion. That's all right. So another story from the Philippines was I went to Tacloban. Tacloban's the place where Typhoon Haiyan hit in November of 2013, and there I talked to a survivor of that typhoon named A.G. Sanyo. And he told me the story. He actually is from Manila, but he was there visiting. His family's from Tacloban, and Tacloban's in the Visayas, in Leyte, the island of Leyte in the Philippines. And he told me his story, because they knew that this typhoon, everyone knew that a typhoon was coming. And he was staying with his family, and then he said, well, I'm not gonna bother you, so I'm gonna go to this hotel. So he went to stay in this hotel, and he got a room on the 4th floor of the hotel. And the hotel was in the city of Tacloban, maybe 4 blocks away from the bay. And he said when he went to sleep, everything was fine, but when he woke up, the roof had ripped off the top of his, where he was staying, or his room, and water was cascading into his room. And mind you, at this point, this is the most powerful typhoon or hurricane ever to make landfall. It's been surpassed by Patricia, actually, a couple years later now, but at that time, that was, if there was a category 6 for wind speed, that would be a category 6, right? So there was water cascading. He described a scenario where he could feel the foundations of the hotel just rocking back and forth, and every single crack and crevice where the wind was blowing so strong that it made a high-pitched whistling sound. And then he told me, he said, and when I interviewed him, he said, I began to prepare for my own death, I thought there's no way I'm going to survive this. He wondered if his family was going to find him in the rubble below. And then he thought he was with that for quite a while, but then he finally got up and went down to the 3rd floor, and it turns out the 3rd floor was the only safe place in the hotel because all of the roof had blown off where he was. The storm surge was so intense that the 1st floor was flooded and up to the 2nd floor. So the 3rd floor, there was about 60 or 70 people congregated, and a long story short, he survives, of course, because he was there to tell the story. But he ends up for the next 3 days, well, I'll quote him, he said, he ended up going and helping a small unit of the fire, of the bomberos, or the firemen, or people, gathering bodies. And he said, with my own 2 hands, I gathered 78 bodies and put them into body bags. And another thing he said was that we knew the typhoon was coming, and it's like climate change. We all know it's coming, or probably we can make that case. It's already clearly here, but we know it's coming, but we didn't know how intense it would be, and it's like climate change. That's what he said. And so, all in all, there was at least, according to the Philippine government, there were 6,000 people that were killed. But that just about everyone says that was undercounted. They just stopped counting. There were so many people, bodies, and then some people say 10, others say 15,000. I heard as high as 20,000. More than 1 million people displaced. And really, these stories are almost to like really what are scientists saying is the future, right? In a way, the status quo, or if the status quo stays, if business as usual keeps going as is, the future is the sea level rise in Marinduque, and those sorts of super extreme storms like Haiyan. Of course, we have so many examples of them. The Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas being the most recent. The devastation on the Bahamas was, I'm sure people saw some of the photos. It was just really, it reminded me of Haiyan after seeing the aftermath of Haiyan, the northern part of the Bahamas, the devastation there, the neighborhood where the Haitian undocumented workers lived, for example, just looked completely in ruins. So that, if right now, if the status quo stays the same, this is what scientists are saying is coming our way more frequently, more intensely. And along with that, along with the status quo, is perhaps the biggest or the most massive displacement of human beings that we've ever seen on this planet. And with that, I'll turn to another part of the world, Central America. So when I was doing research in Central America, actually the story I'm going to tell here is I was on the border, on the Mexican side of the border, in a place called Tenosique. It's in the state of Tabasco. I'm sure some people here are familiar with Tenosique. And Tenosique is actually about 20 miles away from the Guatemalan border, and a lot of people coming north end up in Tenosique. And it's a place where people get on the train. And so when I was there, and I stayed at a shelter there, and when I was at the shelter, I went to the train yard I was just walking around, and maybe I was talking to a few people that were out there, and I ended up talking to these 3, turned out to be small farmers from Honduras, who were just kind of waiting by the rails, and we got to talking, and they said they'd been in the train yards for about 6 days. Their intentions were to go further north to the United States, and when we started talking about like what was going on in Honduras, for them, a 19-year-old young man answered by saying there was no rain, and then there's no rain, there's no harvest, there's no food. It's a crisis, right? And then a crisis that when I looked into what was going on in that year, and that was in June of 2015, it was a major crisis that was hitting. The rains didn't come in what is known as the dry corridor. A mayor in a nearby town where these small farmers are from said it was called it an unprecedented calamity. 1 million people were impacted by a drought-like situations in 2015. And that just that year. I'm going to give you another stat of further years in a minute. And when I talked to a climate scientist who's doing modeling in Central America, actually Chris Castro, who's the husband of Kat Rodriguez, who we know from the Migrant Trail Walk. Chris Castro is a hydrologist from the University of Arizona that's done a lot of climate modeling in Central America. And he calls Central America the quote-unquote ground zero for climate change in the Americas. And in terms of these drought situations, they've been intensifying primarily over the last 10 years. And they're predicted if things stay the same. And then it's really important to say when you talk about the future is changeable. There's a lot of X factors. Things might not, we don't know what's gonna happen in the future, but giving educated guesses how things are going, if things stay the same, these sorts of drought situations are going to get worse. They're going to intensify, they're become more frequent. And that's according to the modeling. And that said, another report came out, actually this is from the World Food Program. They came out last summer, not a year ago last summer, talking about 2 million people impacted by drought-like situations in what is known as the dry corridor. And the dry corridor, of course, is not just Honduras, it's in Guatemala, it's in El Salvador, it goes into Nicaragua, it actually is parts of it is in southern Mexico. It's actually getting bigger and bigger. And so 2 million people, and they calculated that 1.4 million people were in risk for hunger. And mind you, this is like oftentimes, the drought situations are in places where there's subsistence farmers who rely on rains coming at certain times, and if they don't come, then, in like rural Guatemala, people, I think the official poverty levels are very high, like 70 or 80%. So in terms of if the rains don't come for the harvests, you're in a situation of a crisis. So I go back. So like when I go back to think about that moment in 2015 in the train yard, I think, well, how many more people were in that situation? Right? How many more people were there because of this? And well, it's saying that it's like important, as I think many people here know very well. When you think of why people leave or why displacement or why people end up on the move or migrating, there's often so many different factors that are involved. There's just so many different reasons, and it's sometimes hard to pin it on one thing. The sociologist Christian Parenti, he wrote the book Tropic of Chaos, and that came out I think in 2012, where he looked at climate change, and he used a framing called the catastrophic convergence. Catastrophic convergence means like looking at crises, like economic crises, political crises, social crises, and what he adds in is an increasing ecological crisis, and that they converge together. Like often those things are treated as separate, but rather they have to be seen as converging together and compounding each other in important ways. And one of those, Central America, what's going on in Central America, and probably with different political situations, historic situations of dictatorships and militarism situations, economic situations, the violent situations of violence, all this, and then you have what climate change coming and exacerbating. If the drought comes, it exacerbates pre-existing situations, and it seems to me that's when you look at migration, it's always multifaceted. That said, there is a lot of, for the purposes of right now, when you talk about climate and the climate impacts on displacement, there are numbers starting to come out. One of them is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center from 2008 to 2015 they were already, and this is global, they calculate that 22.5 million people were displaced due to climate change, which is different, a little bit different than people displaced due to environment. So they are looking at what scientists are saying are causes of climate change and looking at how many people are displaced. They say that number is too low. The number is too low because they weren't calculating drought. And they weren't calculating what they call the slow onset changes. And then the predictions. The forecasts are pretty dramatic, really. And they're really widely debated, right? You have predictions that for 2050, for example, commonly you'll see between 150 million people displaced to a billion people, right? Like that's a pretty wide range of numbers. But when I was talking to a head researcher from the United Nations who were just doing research, empirical research, connecting the changing climate with displacement and migration, she said, well, the numbers are widely debated, but what we're going to see is something, quote unquote, if things stay the same, well, we're going to see something staggering and without precedent in human history. All that said, right now there is no climate refugee status, right? The official definition of refugee doesn't include anything to do with climate change. There's nothing international. There's no individual countries that have climate refugee status. There are potentialities. Actually, New Zealand might be an exception. I'm not sure if they passed legislation, but they were looking at allowing for 100 to 200 people from Pacific Islands who have been displaced from sea level rise into New Zealand. I think that might have passed. So if that passed, perhaps maybe that's a sign of a change coming. I don't know. A domino effect. If one country does it, several other countries will do it. 100 to 200 people, when you talk about those numbers, fraction of it, right? But who knows? But however, and also when people, a lot of times with displacement due to climate change, especially natural disasters such as hurricanes, you see a lot of people staying close to home. But however, staying in the same country region. So, but as things continue to happen, more and more people are crossing borders, right? And when people cross borders, what happens if you don't have papers? And mind you, with people crossing borders, when you look at the highest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions over the years, over the centuries, those are the places, the United States, the European Union, those are the places that have been fortifying their borders more than any other place. The United States, for example, if you look at carbon emissions from 1900 to the present, to I think 2012, they have emitted 700 times more carbon than Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador combined. Yet these are the places that build up the borders. So now I'm going to turn to borders, but I want to first say, one of the things that I look at in Storming the Wall are these dynamics, like things have been increasing into the present moment, and then educated guesses project that these will go into the future. The impacts of climate change into the present, they've been increasing. If things stay the same, or even if things don't stay the same, there's things set in place, it's going to keep impacting into the future. The degree of it, who knows, right? That's where we're at right now. The displacement, it's been increasing coming into the present, predicted to increase into the future. Borders, same thing. And when you look at borders, and what I mean by borders is border regimes or border enforcement regimes. For example, if you go to the 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, there were 15 border walls. If right now, there are more than 70 border walls. Possibly 77, I think, if I saw the last tally which is done by a scholar out of the University of Quebec who's counting all the border walls in the world. 2/3 of those border walls were constructed post 9/11. So it's happening in accelerated fashion. And I believe when I first started researching storming the wall, there were 62. So even from then to now, you see increasing border walls. And border walls is just one representation of border enforcement, right? Not all places that have really ramped up their border enforcement, like Mexico. Southern Mexico's, there's a ramp up of border enforcement there. No border walls, so that doesn't even count, right? That shows this trend as we into the present of like border enforcement going up. The United States border is one example of many, but it's a perfect example. If you just to go over a few numbers, in 1994, the budget for border and immigration enforcement was $1.5 billion with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or the INS. And in 2018, $23 billion. What is that, like 14 times or 15 times more? 13 times, I don't know what it is. It's a lot more. What I'm trying to say is historic. There's never been this much put into border and immigration enforcement. That number, the 23 billion, comes from adding Customs and Border Protection, CBP, with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. So those numbers combined come to 23 billion. And I haven't done the calculations for 2019. I think it's over 24 billion now. So they keep rising and rising every year, up and up and up and up. When Donald Trump arrived to the White House in 2017, the budget that year was $20 billion. So there's definitely a further increase of since Trump has got into office. However, there was an arsenal at his disposal when he set foot in the White House, right? There's already 700 miles of walls and barriers. There's billions and billions of dollars of technologies. 12,000 motion sensors, implanted motion sensors along the U.S.-Mexico border. Surveillance towers, high-tech cameras that can see 7 miles away. Biometrics. They're experimenting now with drones that have facial recognition, so they can swoop down and take your picture and then put you in a database or something like that. That's what's has been deployed and will be continued to be deployed as border and immigration enforcement. Year after year after year, the budgets go up and up and up. And that just seems to be a trend, and we can talk about that a little bit more if you'd like. But that goes into a more global border regime, right? Which you have the 70 border walls, but you have countless billions of dollars of technologies all over the world in different places all around the world. And that I look a lot into that in this book. And I could talk more about that. I won't go into too many details. But all together, it's like lots of 70 border walls, billions of technologies, probably hundreds of thousands of armed agents. And if you look where they're deployed, it's along the lines of the global north and the global south, or the environmentally exposed, we should say, the people that are coming north and perhaps influenced or impacted due to the changing climate. And one indication that this is going to keep happening is looking at market forecasts. And there's all kinds of market forecasts for border industries. And every single market forecast, and these forecasts are done by analysts who look into, really they look into trends, the dynamics, what's growing. I've seen forecasts that say it's in a boom period, forecasts that show growth, increased growth. And if you look at Homeland Security industry for 2023, it's predicted to be over $700 billion, $744 billion, and that's up from about $300 billion in the mid-2010s. So we're looking at that's going up along with impacts of climate change, right? It's a collision course in a lot of ways, in every way, I should say. And so how does it all tie together? And I want to read a quote from a Pentagon commissioned report from the year of 2003. And this Pentagon commissioned report is, they're looking at a worst case climate scenario. And in the report it says, the United States and Australia are likely to build defensive fortresses around their countries because they have the resources and reserves to achieve self-sufficiency. With diverse growing climates, wealth, technology, and abundant resources, the United States could likely survive shortened growing cycles and harsh weather conditions without catastrophic losses. Borders will be strengthened around the country to hold back unwanted, starving immigrants from the Caribbean islands, an especially severe problem, they put in quotes, or they put in parentheses. And the Bahamas example is really fresh, huh?
Or we didn't take anybody.
Exactly, the visas were denied. Hold back unwanted, starving immigrants, those are the exact words from this assessment, from the Caribbean islands, an especially severe problem, Mexico and South America. And I do believe they omitted Central America due to geographical ignorance more than anything else, because they should be putting Central America in there.
We've got a lot of bases there.
Exactly, yeah, I'm pretty sure they were referring to all of Latin America and all of the Caribbean, and so, yeah, so that's one example of an assessment, probably assessments that have been going on for years and years and years. That was perhaps a more crude assessment. There's another assessment that's bigger than this book that came out in 2007 called Climatic Cataclysm. And that looks at all kinds of, it's more like detailed, it looks at all different temperature variations of what's gonna happen if this, like the heating is 2.5 degrees, 1.5 degrees, 5 degrees. That assessment, again, pretty much says the same thing. Countries are gonna build up their borders, or countries like the United States are gonna build up their borders. One thing to point out, thinking of that particular report, because they stress in that report that the national security planners, in this they were referring to the United States, national security planners look 30 years into the future. So, and I have to paraphrase, but it's pretty dramatic what they say. They say to bring a military platform to the battlefield, you look 30 years into the future. And that's what they say in the assessment. So they're looking 30 years in the future, and that's why I want to make one quick comment about the Trump administration, or Trump himself, in that proud climate denier, right, has denied it in many venues, many different ways, called it a hoax probably 1,000 times. But yet there's many moving parts of the federal government, and you're not going to go to the Department of Defense or even the Department of Homeland Security and find any. Like in the Department of Defense, there's not one 3-star general who's a climate or above that's a climate denier at all. In fact, when you look at the Pentagon, for example, they have the most clear-eyed risk assessors when it comes through the lens of U.S. national security, and probably anywhere, right? So when they look into the future, there's just no possible way they're going to deny what 97% consensus of scientists are saying. Right? They're not going to deny all this stuff. So it's very much a part of every future assessment in the Pentagon. And lo and behold, that is translated to the Department of Homeland Security. So in 2010, the climate change was declared a national security threat for the first time in the United States. In 2014, it showed up in the Department of Homeland Security Quadrennial Review. The Quadrennial Review is the most public statement of mission. The DoD has one and the DHS has one. And in the DHS Quadrennial Review, they look at it through the lens of the 5-point mission of DHS. The 5-point mission of DHS, and let me see if I can remember, it's counterterrorism is number 1, immigration enforcement, border enforcement, cybersecurity, and critical infrastructure. So when something is declared a national security threat, and there's many things that are, but climate change is now one of them, they were then required to look at climate change through that 5-point mission. And through that 5-point mission, you look in that, and you'll see the very droughts that the campesinos, the small farmers, are telling me in Tenosique, the very droughts are very much written and known about in the documents of DHS. And because of those droughts, they say we may have to prepare our borders for mass migrations. And to add to that, there is a new report that just came out just a week ago. And it's CBP's own report on climate change in Central America, where they look at how droughts are affecting small farmers and causing migration. There was reports about it just maybe 4 or 5 days ago. You can check that out as well. So I want to kind of wind down or end on thinking about, well, first of all, is this inevitable, right? Again, talking about the future, right? You talk about the future. There's possibilities, educated guesses. There's a lot of educated guesses about what might happen. Nobody really knows, though, right? But there are a ton of X factors that are happening. But what is there? Is there anything else? Is this inevitable? Does this have to be this world of further borders, and massive displacement? Is this does this have to be this way? And it's interesting, when I was doing Storming the Wall research, if I would have compiled all of it, because I went again around the world to all these different places and just met with different people doing so many different things, and right here in can I get the acronym, the DJPC?
It's right behind your head.
Right.
It's right behind your head.
Oh.
DJPC.
DJPC. I mean, everyone here I'm sure is doing there's lots of people doing lots of things all over the place, so much that I remember when I was doing one of the first presentations on Storming the Wall, just hearing why didn't you catalog what people were doing, And I'm like, well, yeah, if I were to sit down and catalog what people were actually doing, then I'd have a huge volume, and that alone, to me, I think is one of the most inspiring things I took out of doing this research and Storming the Wall. It's just so many people doing so many different things, and I just kind of want to end with one example that has to do directly with the border, and directly with the U.S.-Mexico border, that is. And it happened in, I went as part of the research to a place that was just to the east of Agua Prieta Douglas, and a ranch called San Bernardino Ranch. And in this ranch, they were doing a water harvesting project. And so I went there to interview the people about the water harvesting project. And the first thing that the people went to show me, my guides for this project, was not the actual water harvesting project, but where the border wall had been dragged into Mexico a 1/4 mile and was literally being eaten by planet Earth. So they took me out to this place called Silver Creek, and there was a part of what was vehicle barrier, I guess, and it was literally in the ground. So what happened was in 2014, exactly actually what's happening now. We've been getting, one of the effects of climate change in Tucson is the more hurricanes coming from the Pacific. So we get the remnants right now. And actually, when I was leaving 2 days ago, there's tornado warnings around Tucson, and we never get tornado warnings. But in 2014, another hurricane, Hurricane Odile, the remnants came and they hit the Chiricahua Mountains, just unleashed rain. The rain came pouring down out of the mountains, down the washes, and just slammed right into the border wall, and just took parts of the border wall with it, right? And this is one part of it. It was it took it a 1/4 mile into Mexico. I mean, these are real heavy. Yeah. And so there it was, it was literally the planet Earth was coming up and devouring it. There's purple flowers around, coming out of the ground. There were arachnids, spider webs hanging from it, and it's wow. And so that was the first thing I saw. So I was wow, this is not inevitable. Left alone, this would be eaten by planet Earth, right? That's what would happen. And then, lo and behold, I look and I see it had been replaced, of course. And there was another vehicle barrier a 1/4 mile up. And then there was a Border Patrol vehicle with a green stripe sitting behind the vehicle barrier, who seemed to be looking at us with his binoculars. And behind the Border Patrol vehicle, there was a new integrated fixed tower, which is a surveillance tower, which was freshly built with all that kind of advanced camera systems. So I have certain, they have cameras that can see 7 miles away, so it's quite possible we were being seen with the Border Patrol and the camera at the same time. But before that, in the wash, in the Silver Creek, there were the gabions, and that was the purpose of my visit, to see the gabions being, and really strikingly, the gabions had this look of one of those intricately carved stone walls, right? That it looked like a kind of stone wall in its own right. And I say that because it's like, here it is, a kind of tale of two walls. But the stone, the gabions, had nothing to do about a big system of exclusion. It was more about when those monsoon the waters came, it slowed down the flow of the water, so then the earth could then absorb the water, and that's exactly what has been happening, right? And so the guides there, they were showing me the native grasses started growing back. Wow, the desert willows, they started growing back. Then they said the water table, and this, mind you, this is a place in a drought, like a 15-year drought. Every single water table is going down. They said the water table has risen 30 feet in this little region. And I said, wow, that's a miracle. And they said, no, it's not a miracle. We just piled up rocks. And that's exactly how this is happening. And then, of course, the water rising the border doesn't stop the water from rising, so it rises equally on both sides. So the wildlife refuge across the border, they're happy with these projects. And then a community in Ejido that's just to the south of there also saw the water rising in their community, where they've seen less and less water. And I think this is a really important thing to point out, because when you look again at these Pentagon assessments for northern Mexico, one of the things they bring up is water scarcity. Water scarcity, the droughts, that's going to cause, they say that's going to cause uproot people, maybe cause people to head north. And here it is, there's piling up rocks, the water table rising. It's a small scale, it's really small scale, of course, but it's happening, and the water rising isn't that effective yet, right? The creek is running maybe 4 months instead of 3 months with water in it, but it's a small change. That's a very small change. And so just to end, I want to, so I talked to, this project was a project called Cuenca Los Ojos. And I talked to one of the founders of Cuenca Los Ojos. And then I decided to throw the number at the time when I was in the interview. The border immigration budget was $20 billion. So I said, so what could you do with $20 billion, right? Right? And then she began to talk, and she just started. And one of the things that I didn't bring my recorder. I just was kind of an off question that I just thought, and she just gushed out. Like, she started naming places I'd never even heard of that were so far away, and yeah, so I just kind of want to leave it with that. Maybe there are probably lots of little examples of how, there are choices we can make about how we go forward, and that's one of them, but there's many more examples beyond that one. And with that, I'll just leave it for discussion. Yeah, I really would. Yeah, because the way that it's so often framed is in those very, at best, very, very narrow framings, or at worst, very racist framings. And to make it like way, to have a more expansive and understanding of like just the loan when you think of climate change, that the United States is a historic, the largest historic emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, right? We're fortifying our border. Those sorts of understandings would hopefully lead, people to have a wider, a more profound understanding of what's happening. And right now, the way it's framed, I think it's like the word border security on its own. I think it should be like taken away. I think it should be just stricken, right? The word border security, the term border security is inaccurate. it's not true unless you start thinking security for who, right? It's not security, like border security, the prevention through deterrence system that's set up, strategy that's set up on the border right now, right, forces people to be as insecure as they possibly can, even death, it causes death, right? And it's no, so how can you call something border security? Like when there's at least 7,500 bodies or remains found since this prevention through deterrence strategy was implemented. How is that border security? And then when you talk to people who live in the borderlands, like in many different places where you have to go through checkpoints to go to school, you have to go to checkpoints to go to the doctor, you have to go to checkpoints to go to the grocery store, checkpoints that racially profile, and they're sanctioned by the state to do so. Like the DHS is sanctioned by the federal government to racially profile. Then like who feels secure in these, you know, when you're a resident in these areas, or when you have like armed agents, you know, that so you have this like misframing of what it is, right? It's not border security. That if you frame it like that, then it creates this idea that it's a protectorate, so we're being protected by something, and is that really true? And B, nothing exists on the other side of the border. There's no other dynamic. Like people are coming because of their own chaos, and then so they like to look at that framing and then move it and then expand it to understand it like in a different way. What is security for? Oh, is it security for this bigger kind of global system? Is it security for business as usual to keep happening? Is it security for economic model in Mexico that for example, where corporations can go across the border without any problems at all, or and then when you start getting more expansive, hopefully that could hopefully change perceptions about what this is about. Hopefully, but I don't know. That sometimes when a person's or a people or a group of people are entrenched in a certain way of thinking, it's hard to disentrench them. But there's a whole like middle ground, I think, that's of people that probably could be really swayed and influenced if information was more, or the framing was put in a different way. Yes.
It just kind of offset the whole framing of sort of what we accept as border security, the idea that climate would be a threat. I think one of the most interesting parts that I got from when I read the book was this whole idea about like green security, of how like CBP and the DoD are basically framing their own technology as climate friendly, even though they're inflicting the damage. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and kind of where that aspect goes. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, you could go to any of the surveillance towers, for example, that I was just mentioning, and see a solar panel that's right next to it. The CBP has had a 28% goal of 28% reduction of emissions. The Ajo station, the new border, I should say it was new, I guess. I've been talking about the Ajo station long enough that it's been around for 5 years, I think. But that was the most, like, I guess, what was the word, sustainable government building when it was first built. And they put solar panels on it. They use recycled water. And one of the most funny things about that one is that when they're in the brochure, they say, and we have a bike, we have a system set up for biking so the agents can bike into work. Anyone who knows where the Ajo station is and why, and most of the agents actually live in Phoenix. And so most of the agents commute from 2 hours away to the Ajo station, but they make a big deal of the biking and stuff like that. So yeah, there's this emphasis on the solar power turning to renewable energy with goals. And another real interesting thing I just want to add to that, and then I'll go on to the next question. Was some of the military, when they're talking about turning to solar power, turning to renewable energy. One official he made a huge deal at a conference I went to on climate and national security in Washington. And he talked a lot about, it's great to turn to renewable energy, and he made a big deal to talk about the polar bears and how that will help the polar bears. And he talked about, it helped this and that. But he said, from our perspective, and this is the perspective we look at, it makes us more powerful from a military perspective. And he said it makes us more lethal, right? James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, he said pretty much the same thing in 2003 when he was commanding troops in Iraq. He's like, cut me from the tether of fossil fuels, like getting fuel supplies into where places of occupation. So if you if you have renewable energy, then the idea is that you could be quicker, be more, and this is a more lethal. You'll be more powerful. You'll be able to get there quicker. So there's that part of it as well. Yes. Yeah, you and then you.
Well, I'm just thinking about your title, storming the walls. And if you have enough, and I'm just kind of thinking, if you have enough people, millions and millions of people that are desperate, are these walls actually, is it more symbolic? Or, I mean, are they really, do they think they're really going to work? I mean, I saw this movie on Robin Hood a while back, a real hokey movie, and they're storming the castle, and they're pouring, are we going to start to pour boiling oil over them too? And I mean,
are the walls actually going to work?
Yeah. Is it more symbolic, or do they? I mean,
So right now.
Can't hear anything over here.
Okay, are the walls more symbolic? Are the walls gonna work, like these walls, or are they more symbolic? So right now, if you go to Nogales, you'll see the wall there, which is about 20 feet high, and now it's with 5 rows of coiling razor wire on the wall. I mean, it's a very imposing, symbolic. It's very extreme to see it. Even before that, it was really extreme, because you'd see the wall like going up and down, sneaking up and down through the hills, and then go on for miles and miles and miles and miles. But you still talk to a border patrol agent, and they'll say, well, people can get over those walls rather quickly. So the walls are like, as one agent said, a quote-unquote speed bump, and this is from that enforcement perspective. But the walls simultaneously, according to agents, are a part of what is this bigger enforcement system. So they're a barrier, where if you look at where the walls are, they put a lot of reinforcement with technologies, and then with agents. And with the technologies and the agents, that's when they become really difficult to get across. As it is in Nogales, it's very difficult. People still do it with all that, but most people circumvent it, and that's a prevention through deterrence. So yeah, you have to think of the walls, like in the case of Trump, it's like the way that he talks about walls is, it seems to me at least, it's this xenophobic symbol that he throws to it's like the red meat to his base. And the idea of a wall repelling unwanted people, people of color mainly, keeps us very symbolic. There's white supremacy attached to it in the symbolism, and there was before, but in a Trump situation, it becomes even more. It becomes even more sharpened, right? And so yeah, I think it's like has a symbolic, but it creates, it's part of this border infrastructure, and it can never be like the way that Trump talks about it. It's like you just put a wall up and that's that. And what's really happening is this gigantic system is being put in place that in terms of the U.S.-Mexico border, it's going 100 miles inland. So the wall is just one part of many parts of layers, multi-layers, that keep growing and growing and growing, and when those budgets get bigger and bigger, there's just more to be put in these layers, and that's exactly what's happening on the southern border. It's happening on the northern border. It's happening more on the coast, and it's happening out into the world as well. And that's the way I think you have to look at it. Did you have a question? You and then you.
Yeah, I'm curious about kind of big picture framings that you've encountered, because it's all about storytelling, right? That you're describing two processes that feed one another, right? That overconsumption already is leading to the crisis, then the crisis causes people to have to migrate, and it exacerbates already resistance on the part of different countries. But the reaction to build a wall is a very quick and pithy way to, it's one quick pithy narrative, and I think we should not assume that we all will respond with our best selves in the face of being overwhelmed by global crisis that might already feel overwhelming before it's happened. So I'm curious if there's other narratives. We know what the build a wall narrative looks like. We know what Fortress America looks like. Are there other narratives and framings that you found that help people to wrestle morally to actually be their best selves in the face of this, beyond just the critiques? I mean, is there this alternate story that's being told that invites people into this alternate future?
I think that's what's needed, actually. There are, but they're not strong, right? The alternate stories of for the example I've seen in my research is that, like in the U.S., the buildup has been very much a bipartisan affair, right? Like the first operations was the Clinton administration in the 1990s. Operation Gatekeeper. Operation Gatekeeper is about to have its 25-year anniversary on October 1st, and those are the operations that really started infusing money into this and building it up. And then there was that, and then 9/11 happened, so tons more money just got infused in. And then the Obama administration just kept the budgets growing as well. And so from that perspective at least, which is, I know is a very limited perspective, but from the perspective of the national politics, there hasn't been an alternate story. It's all, even to this day, like you see like, you know, big Democrats that will say we're totally against this wall, but then in the next breath they'll say we have to invest in technologies instead. And the technologies are the same. It's probably even worse, right? They're probably even worse when it comes down to it than the wall, but they sound nicer, right? When you say it, you're like, oh, technologies. Well, yeah, that's nice, and that sounds great. Yeah, but when you think about but then the technologies are not impact. Like Henry Cuellar, he talks quite a bit. He's a Democrat from South Texas, right on the border, and he talks quite a bit. He wrote a big op-ed like a year ago saying, "Down with the wall." Right, this wall is from the 13th century. That's what he said, and then he goes on to say, we put in technologies instead. And what do they have in southern Texas? They have the tethered aerostats, right? The surveillance blimps that look out with the big cameras and actually look into Mexico. They have like all kinds of technologies. They are deploying technologies. Then we go back to the drones or the facial recognition. What do you mean by technologies? And then you look at Cuellar, and then you see, oh, you have campaign contributions from these companies that are making the technologies, right? And big campaign contributions from Geo Group, which is the private prison company that everyone knows about here, especially in Denver, right? And so the story keeps going back to this idea again of border security, right? What the border, like, it's like you gotta, like, the shackle of the terminology border security has to go out the door. And then the alternative stories are there. There are people telling them. I'm sure there's people telling them in this very room. There's people people who live in the borderlands are telling the stories. Like Rebecca's book on Contraband Corridor on the Chiapan Mexican borderlands talks about a lot of like how people are going across borders and the kind of cooperation for survival, right? This kind of, how the abolition of this apparatus is happening, but in terms of how local people are interacting across the border, or as much as they can. And so these other stories have to be told, and one of them is like, what is this thing? Like, this thing is not even unpacked. Like, you go to certain places and you talk about the border, a lot of people don't even know there is a lot of places with a wall already, right? Or that there's been these billions of dollars that have been put into it. Or that in 2012, the border immigration budgets surpassed all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. Year after year after year, it grows and grows and grows with little public debate. So my long-winded answer, sorry for the long-winded answer, is that I think that narrative is there, and there's people telling it, and I think it really needs to be like uplifted more and more, because it's really, you know, when you really look at it, agreeing, something is agreeing. When you really look at it, when you start looking at what the border actually does, it becomes, and you really look at it, it becomes like, is this a crime against humanity? And are we going to stand for a crime against humanity?
And maybe we should follow the money. Who's making all the profits from this? I mean, this is a very profitable enterprise.
That is correct.
This is leading all into what I want to talk about briefly and get your feedback, because I've been doing some research around. So, yeah, the Clinton administration puts in this gatekeeper, early border militarization, all around the same time as NAFTA comes
Right.
through, right?
Yeah.
So, here we have borderlands between the United States, Mexico. Right now, you know, since 1994 or so, those whole areas are differential zones of labor, right? Those are meant for low-price labor, unpaid work, you know, these sorts of things. And you have depeasantization that's happening in Central America, climate change accelerating that. They're attempting to put these special economic zones in Honduras, which you talk about in here. You know, from the position of capital, they're attempting to deal with this crisis in some sort of way to reorganize relations on their behalf, okay? Because here we have incarcerated labor, detention centers can easily be made into private prisons when people are forced then to do free slave labor, you know? At the same time, this summer, 2019, Mexico had a huge strike wave, and many of those strikes were won throughout the borderland area. So I just wonder if you could speak to that this is something that Harsha Walia addresses in Undoing Border Imperialism, as this precarization, globalization, all of this, put the borders in, because we gotta keep the capital flowing.
I strongly recommend that book by Harsha Walia, Undoing Border Imperialism. It's really a great read. That's exactly what you're talking about, is her main thesis in Undoing Border Imperialism. The idea that the very countries that are responsible by their policies for displacement, looking at economic, military policies, but increasingly climate change and ecological, are the very countries that are fortifying their borders. So borders have become a part of the imperialism, right? Part of managing the world, part of like maintaining business as usual. And really, in one hand, as I talk about this a lot in this book, Empire Borders, but where I draw from Harsha Walia's work, of course, because Harsha Walia's her thesis is really compelling. Is that there is an open border policy, right? There's an open border policy. When you look back to NAFTA, 1994, you look before 1994, Doris Meisner, who's INS commissioner, speaking before the U.S. Congress, saying NAFTA is going to cause displacement in Mexico. We need to harden our borders. And at that time, you have Operation Hold the Line about to start, and then Operation Gatekeeper, and then all of a sudden the prevention through deterrence strategy just goes through all urban areas along the border. So you take that, and that's pretty much, that's the thesis of Harsha Walia, right? That they knew the knowledge that something, in this case it was NAFTA, was going to cause economic hardship, which it did, right? Like estimates vary, but there's at least 2 million, I hear the figure quite a bit of 2 million small farmers who were displaced due to NAFTA. And then putting up a harsher border regime, which is exactly what happened in the United States, to then manage what the people that were displaced by this policy. And then you see the similar things when you see the assessments for climate change. Like people are predicting, like Meisner did in 1992, there's going to be this amount of migration coming, and then the assessments, we have to build up our borders. because of that. And now you see it in the document paper, so you see it kind of similar. And then in that sense, right, you have the U.S. again, one of the highest historical emitter, leading the charge in terms of border enforcement. Not only on the U.S.-Mexico border, it should stress, as in this book, it's an externalization of this border enforcement that goes throughout the entire world. It's going like when you look at Mexico's southern border and its buildup, it's a lot of it. There's a lot of pressure and resources and trainings coming from the United States. Guatemala's new border patrols. Again, I talked to a commander from there, a creation of the United States Embassy in Guatemala. Dominican Republic's border patrol, that's right across the line from Haiti. Again, the U.S. Embassy was the one that trained and then gave them resources.
And then expulse the Haitians.
Right, it's set up is exactly like very similar actually to the border. In Dominican Republic was the place where I saw they were setting their X's like the Border Patrol does in Nogales. So that's like happening throughout not only the hemisphere, but you see U.S. border programs going into places like Jordan. So there's $300 million that Raytheon Corporation that got a few years ago to build a border surveillance system between Jordan and Syria. Of course, Syria is one of the biggest refugee crises in the world, and Iraq and Jordan. You have Kenya, the Kenya-Somali, Kenya, all the borders, right? There's a CBP attaché in the Nairobi embassy and Kenya has its first border patrol. It was formed in 2009. And the border with Somalia, they're building a border wall. So you look everywhere. I'm just naming just a few examples, right, that I looked at in this book. But really, the point is that this sort of border building is happening everywhere, and the U.S. is behind a lot of it, or at least pushing it, or there's programs, and that's a part of it. It's like to maintain a global system, and a global system where if business as usual keeps as is, right, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. There's more and more people displaced, and there's an economic or an ecological catastrophe that's exacerbating all of it. Right?
Yeah. So Elizabeth Warren says, fighting climate change isn't about plastic straws or cheeseburgers. It's about three industries producing 70% of the pollution that's warming the planet. And Greta Thunberg is similarly, this week said, it's not about the individual stuff that we do, like crossing the Atlantic in a little boat instead of a jet, so much as it's about, having governments and industry stop looking at the bottom line and looking at survival of the planet. You talk about the profiteering in your books on border security, right? And all the money that's being made there and the political influence that generates. You want to connect some of those dots for us?
Yeah, actually, I should say that I was an author or with a team of a report that just came out a week ago, and it's called More Than a Wall, actually, and it looks at that exact thing, like who are the top contractors getting contracts from Customs and Border Protection, and what are, not only that, but what kind of campaign contributions are they giving to certain key people and certain key committees, such as the House Homeland Security Committee, the very committee where a lot of the legislation comes out of for border stuff, such as Appropriations Committee. That's where they dole out the budgets and who gets what amount of money, and there's a ton of money. Well, first of all, I should say between 2008 and between 2006 and 2018, there were, I can't remember, but it was like 55,000 contracts given out by CBP to the tune of $27 billion to private contractors. So that, to put that in perspective, $27 billion of contractors is the equivalent to the accumulated budgets of border and immigration enforcement from the years 1975 to 1998. 23 years, it's about $27 billion. $27 billion in contracts just between 2006 and 2018. So that just goes to show you how much it's shifted. And to many of these contracts go to, we identified 14 really top contractors. Many of them, a lot of them are weapons companies, arms companies, like the Lockheed Martins, the Boeings, the Raytheons, the General Dynamics, General Atomics, which was a subsidiary of General Dynamics. General Atomics does the drones. There's a fleet of drones that the U.S. Border Patrol has. And so so when a Homeland Security's appropriation bill comes about, basically when they say how much so before I used to think, oh, there's a debate about these budgets that kept going up and up every year after year after year. There is very much a debate year after year after year. It's behind closed doors. And the amount of these companies that do the lobbying, behind closed doors, every time an appropriation bill comes up, every time immigration reform comes up, you see a spike of companies doing lobbying and giving money to certain people. And that's why, remember in 2013 there was a big immigration reform bill, the Gang of Eight reform bill, that passed the Senate but didn't pass the House. In that reform bill, there's $45 billion given to border. $45 billion. And when you looked at in the details, they had specific companies designated for specific technologies. And those specific companies that were lobbying, and a couple of them were lobbying like to the tune of $70,000 a day during that debate. They were the ones. So that's one example of, and I got that from actually an AFSC report. AFSC has been doing some really great work on I know there's people that are AFSC people in this audience right now. They have done excellent work on this, looking at this kind of border industry and its impacts and what it means and how we have to really consider that as we move forward. Oh, you had a question, right? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I did. I'm just curious on your thoughts about including climate change and the categorization for refugee status, and just what your opinion is, because there's people on both sides. So.
I really think the way the refugee status is set up is in my opinion, I guess, is very it's very limited. In my opinion, okay, it's like if people are on the move for whatever reason, there's a really real reasons why they're on the move, right? If people are coming across the border, or risking their lives coming across the border. And why I'm saying this, it's always been baffling to me, like when you look at economic policies over the years, and economic policies where people cannot make ends meet, and they get thrown what some people call economic violence, right? Where they cannot make ends meet, and they skip meals, or they take their children out of school, or something. Why is that's never been considered? Like even now, there's economic, or there's people that are refugees. Obviously, the refugees that are considered refugees are definitely refugees. I'm not trying to argue against that. People fleeing persecution and violence, of course. But the limitations therein just seems so limited. And right now, I know there's a lot of debate about climate and adding the climate, the environmental, and I think that there's no refugee status. There's more people being displaced, as is being shown by, the internal displacement monitoring center and others. United Nations is showing that. And in a lot of these cases, people are going to be displaced and they cannot go back, right? If you in sea level rise situations, like when you look at the maps of even yesterday, a new report came out from the UN saying we are underestimating the amount of sea level rise for the century. Sea level rise is you can't go back, right? The sea's in, the surge is in, your house is flooded, you cannot go back. And so many cities are on the coast, right? I can't see how a situation where you can't go back would not be considered a refugee. or like, or in the drought situations, the desertification. So I don't know, like this idea of, I don't know, I'm as you can tell, I'm very much on the idea of expanding what a refugee means, and this, it seems like it goes into semantics a lot, and those semantics really, they're, when you think about who's included and then who's excluded, they can become very violent, right, for those people. That's my take on that. Yes.
I heard you speak at the first border in Metro and Nogales a few years ago. And I remember one of the things that really stuck with me was you're telling us that there were, I think at that time, 57 Israeli border security technology companies operating around Tucson. Is that number, is that increased? Are they a major part of what's going on?
Yeah, so the Israeli company Elbit Systems, they got one of the most sought after contracts. I believe it was in 2014, and that was to construct 53 surveillance towers in southern Arizona. That's the first part of that. Surveillance towers that were sold to CBP after being deployed on the West Bank in the Palestinian occupied
I think
territories.
you referred to that was their laboratory.
That's exactly what not I might have said, but also a brigadier general from the IDF said. Like the laboratory, I went to a conference where he called Gaza a laboratory for this kind of surveillance technology. So there's Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems is from Haifa. It's one of the top contractors out of Israel. There's other Israeli companies. Elta is getting more and more. Elta got a contract for one of the border wall prototypes that went up by San Diego. They specialize in what they call smart borders. Most of the Israeli companies, they do smart borders, right? With So with tons of sensor systems. Like the way they describe it is like they're alive, like they can sense you coming, right? And then what the kind of system that's being put in place in southern Arizona right now is kind of a replica, or at least it is a replica in a lot of ways of the Israeli system, but in a different sense, it's a different territory, it's much bigger. But the idea of these surveillance towers, they call them integrated fixed towers, meaning they're not separate, they communicate with each other. The feeds, they have a radar that has a 15-mile radius, cameras that can see far away, night vision, cameras, that sort of thing, and they all feed into these command and control centers, and that's an Israeli model that when you talk to like Israel, like different Israeli officials or the Israeli industry, and that's what I did that. I went quite a bit in Empire of Borders. I went there. I went to conventions there. I talked to Israeli industry, and they're that's proud of this export of the system which is of command and control centers, and that's what you were seeing on now Arizona southern border. But I think like what I've heard is that DHS has declared that all a success, quote unquote. And so what I wouldn't be surprised is if Elbit got another contract for South Texas quite soon, probably in the next year or two, and they'll start building there. One other thing to mention is that one place that was holding off was the Tohono O'odham Nation. And the Tohono O'odham Nation, of course, is the Tohono O'odham, the Aboriginal land of the Tohono O'odham goes deep into Mexico, right? So when the border came, it just divided the land, of course, without any consultation of the Tohono O'odham. And the towers, when they announced the 53 towers, 10 of them, or 16 of them were supposed to go in the Tohono O'odham Nation. And that was the one place that was like, there was a bit of a resistance to it, and they finally capitulated in a meeting in March where the tribal council said, okay, you can build 10 such surveillance towers. So that seems to be now is going to be the last phase. And when they're done with that, then what they call the virtual wall, and that's that layer of border of surveillance technologies, that phase of it will be completed in Arizona, and they'll probably, what I've heard them say, and this is by looking at like the technology people at CVP is they'll focus. They're already doing it, but they'll focus more on Texas, southern Texas. I wouldn't be surprised if New Mexico, because there's more people. You see people routing through New Mexico more and more. So I wouldn't be surprised if that would happen too.
And they're getting better at it. You remember, 14, 15 years ago when they put the first towers up and Lockheed,
Yes.
I think it was Lockheed. and
Boeing.
It was Boeing,
Yeah.
and the software that was supposed to connect the towers to the border patrol stations where they were looking at the pictures.
Yeah.
You know, it didn't work, and they figured it out finally that the code was written in Hebrew. And so
I did not know that part. That part I did not know. That's an interesting story. Yeah.
Where are you tomorrow in Colorado Springs?
Colorado College. And I'm in a class in the morning, and there's a noon lunch, I think. It's at noon, it's a lunch.